I want to have a conversation with the clergy of the Kansas East and Kansas West annual conferences. In an extended cabinet meeting recently, we were reviewing the statistics for our conferences to try to see how we did during 2007. And I became aware that a number of churches have not yet turned in their statistics. There was a conversation about the attitude that people have about them. And it was discussed that perhaps this was a teaching moment for me as bishop to share with you the spiritual reasons behind this Methodist practice. Remember, I was a pastor for 11 years, actually a 12th year when I was interim pastor and had to fulfill the statistical reports for that church as well. So 12 times I went through the routine of counting the number of baptisms, averaging worship attendance, counting the number of people in small groups, looking at the financial statistics. Since I left off being a pastor, I understand the forms have gotten more complicated. And so it is that a number of you are looking at these forms and saying, why do we have to go through this stuff? Well, let me share my perspective on that issue. I think statistics have relevance for ministry. Every statistic we count is a way of asking, how well are we doing in our service to the reign of God? Let's talk about worship attendance for a minute. Every week, our churches gather people for holy worship. They come Sunday mornings, Saturday nights. They come together to praise God, to hear the Word, to receive the sacraments, to gather together as God's community, kind of like a holy huddle before they leave and go out into the world to serve the Lord in whatever capacities the Lord has put before them. Counting worship attendance is one of the most vital statistics in the life of our church. It measures how many people are receiving the ministry of our church and the vitality of a congregation. It's not simply numbers. Oh, I know, some people deride a numbers game, but every one of those numbers is a real, live person, a soul, somebody who is seeking a closer relationship with God. And so when we count worship attendance, it's a way of asking, how are we doing? How many people are we reaching? And from one year to the next, looking at the trend, we know that the trend is going up, down, or staying the same. There's no simple evaluation of this. As I've tried to say in my 8 characteristics of a healthy congregation, the trends in worship attendance have to be measured against the demographic realities of the church that you're serving. If your county is declining, having a stable worship attendance is maybe a sign of great success. If your city is growing rapidly, having a 5% gain in worship attendance is maybe a sign that you're not doing as well as you ought to be doing. These statistics ought to be important for your own understanding of how you're doing. We're professionals. We're people who have given ourselves, most of us full-time, some part-time, to the ministry of the church. And so we ought to always be striving for excellence. When I was talking to some leaders of the Lilly Endowment, they were making to me the spiritual point that said, God deserves our very best. Too much talk about excellence has been done by business leaders and people in business schools. Why aren't we Christians talking about the incredible beauty of the gospel and God's deserving our very best? How do you know what the best is? Well, measuring things is a way of checking how well you're doing. There are people who talk about the number of small groups that there ought to be in a church. Lyle Schaller, years ago, in Assimilating New Members, said there ought to be 6 small groups for every 100 people in attendance. How many small groups are there in your church? Have you counted? Have you looked at them? Have you been seeking to form new small groups? One of the things I've been teaching is that every Christian ought to be involved in worship weekly and involved in a small group where they're being spiritually fed, and involved in a small group where they're feeding others, either physically or spiritually. Until you count the number of small groups and ask, do we have enough, you won't really know how well you're doing. In the Kansas area, we've been inviting people to make a transformation survey. That's a way of getting the leadership of the church, lay leader and pastor, but hopefully in a broader setting, maybe in a church conference, to talk about, are we a transforming church or a declining church or a maintaining church? We do those surveys based on these numbers. So it is that we need to know how well each church is doing so that we as a conference can band together and support each other. The conference staff have been providing toolboxes geared to whether a church is in each of those categories and what are the areas in which they need to grow and improve. Therefore, completing these statistical reports is crucial. Now comes the accountability part. We need the reports done by the end of January. That's the way we can know as a whole conference how well we're doing. The most important part is I think each of you all as pastors need to know by the end of January what was 2007 like. If you wait till March, April, or God forbid May or June or July, then you won't really know because you will have gone 6 months and by then it'll be old news that's out of date. Sort of like balancing your checkbook. You ought to know how much money you've got in the bank. Why? Because you're a miser? No. So that you'll know how much you can give to the church next week. You see, it's about measuring how well you're doing in God's service. We've learned from the incubator process in the cabinet that if you're going to be serious about improving your ministry, about being all that God's called you to be, you have to measure. If you're not measuring, then you're not really serious about it. We know that spiritually there are some things hard to measure. How has a person grown in their faith, or grown in their hope, or grown in their love? Those intangibles are at the heart of the gospel and they can't be measured very well. But you can measure behaviors. So that if somebody is going on a mission trip and giving a week out of their time to go work on repairs in Greensburg or hurricane relief or some other kind of mission work, then you know that somehow something's going on there, and that's something that's measurable. The giving of our dollars, that's measurable. Attendance at church, that's measurable. We think if you're serious about being a missionally effective congregation, the leaders of the church, pastor, administrative council, lay leader, whoever is, in helping to shape the direction of that congregation, ought to be paying attention to the statistics. That's why this is a spiritual discipline, and completing the statistics in a timely manner by the deadline, the end of January, that's an important matter. It's important for you. It's also important for the whole annual conference. Now, I know that there are a number of people who say, well, I'll get around to it. I have more important things to do. I know that there are crises that arrive in the life of a pastor. But if you have an entire month of January, somewhere in that time, you can find the time to get it done. I believe that, and I simply don't understand, other than procrastination, why you couldn't turn the statistics in by the deadline. Now, in this process, as I've been sort of asking, where are all these reports? Some of you have said, you know, these reports are too darn complicated. Well, there's a long discussion about that in the extended cabinet, and an awareness that we in Kansas have people who can make an impact on the national church. We have people who can reach the folks who are making those decisions about which things need to be reported. You want to know what I think? There are too many things being asked of you. I think we need to look again and say, which of these reports really are crucial? How can we lighten the load of the reporting so that we're only asking the important questions and some of this other stuff can be left behind? If you have ideas about that, if you have input, would you please send them to the secretary in my office? Lindsay Peck is now working with Susan Stuber. And you can reach Lindsay at lpeck@kswestumc.org. Send her your input, and I promise you it will be heard. You see, these reports are not set by just the Kansas East or Kansas West conferences. These are general church reports. And I know that there are some people who have gotten things added to those reports over the years that want more and more and more counted. Sometimes they don't think as carefully as they should about the burdens placed on local churches in the reporting process. That's why we need to be an advocate for you all. We need to say, this is what local church pastors and leaders really need to know, and we understand this is what the general church needs to know, so let's get to the best possible form and see what impact we can make. I assure you that there are people in our conferences who can get that kind of message to the right places, and we're prepared to do that. These are the spiritual reasons behind this practice. United Methodists have been counting people ever since John Wesley's day. We think having an accurate vision of what God's doing and how we can be involved in that, and then testing, have we made any progress? That's part of the methodical, disciplined life that the Wesleys called us into more than 250 years ago. Thank you for your cooperation in this. We look forward to your feedback. We also look forward to having 100% compliance on the reporting of the forms. Thanks.